O Trump não tem o direito de acordar de manhã achar que pode ameaçar um país. Não tem direito. Ele não foi eleito para isso. Pare com esse maldito bloqueio a Cuba e deixe os cubanos viverem a vida deles. Não é possível que nós fiquemos quietos diante disso, gente. Bem, eu disse ao Ramaphosa que ele deve comparecer ao G20. Deve comparecer, não pode não ir porque o Trump disse que ele não ir. Ele deve ir ao G20, ele é mesmo nato. Ele vai e vamos chegar lá para ver o que vai acontecer. Se vão deixar ele entrar ou não. Nós não podemos permitir que o mundo circunve ao comportamento de um presidente que acha que por e-mail ou por Twitter ele pode taxar produtos, pode punir países e pode fazer guerra. O que a gente vê todo santo dia é declarações, que eu não sei se brincadeira ou não, o presidente Trump dizendo que já acabou com 8 guerras e que ainda não ganhou o Prêmio Nobel da Paz. Então é importante que a gente dê logo um Prêmio Nobel para o presidente Trump para não ter mais guerra. Aí o mundo vai viver em paz, tranquilamente.
As you just saw, President Lula has been relentless over the past few weeks, publicly attacking President Trump on a number of matters, including even purely internal American issues. During Lula's recent trip to Europe, where, by the way, Lula is much more respected and listened to than in Brazil, he criticized Trump almost daily, even when standing beside other leaders, as when he made the Portuguese president uncomfortable with his harsh sarcasm toward the American president, who wasn't there to respond. But what's behind this seemingly wild and spontaneous pattern of behavior over weeks?
Uma coisa, vocês já perceberam que o presidente Trump quer governar o mundo pelo Twitter? É fantástico. Todo dia ele fala uma coisa e todo dia o mundo fala aí da coisa que ele falou. Todo dia. Você acha que é possível, gente?
The main reason for all this is that President Trump is actually Lula's last and most promising card for the upcoming Brazilian election in October. Every major polling organization shows that Lula and the mediocre right-wing Senator Flávio Bolsonaro are at a stalemate, and that Lula's disapproval rate remains astonishing. There isn't really anything new that Lula may come up with until October to reverse this dark scenario. Lula has already put in effect a lot of social programs during the last years and tax discounts for the poorest, and none of it has produced a sustained reversal of his unpopularity. Brazilian television is currently flooded with expensive market campaigns by the federal government trying to convince the public of how good and generous Lula's administration really is, but none of it has worked. The prospect of ending Lula of ending his long career on the world stage by losing to a less than mediocre politician who is known only for being the son of Brazil's former president and for his own corruption allegations, Flávio Bolsonaro. This dark prospect has been a heavy burden on Lula's back. However, about 6 months ago, things weren't like that for President Lula. When Trump imposed a 50% tariff on most Brazilian products as a response to the then legal siege around Trump's ally Jair Bolsonaro, that was an attempt by Trump to try to save Bolsonaro from jail, President Lula at that moment soared as the champion of Brazil's sovereignty against the US, against an intervention by the United States trying to save a Brazilian politician who was about to go to jail. And Lula's ultimate victory came with the withdrawal of the tariffs on November of last year, which made Lula appear as a strong, clever, mature leader in a Trumpist, unpredictable and crude world. However, that was the only bright spot in Lula's unpopular and lackluster third presidency. Lula's administration has no major achievements. Brazil's economy is doing well from a macroeconomic point of view, but that's not the perception of most Brazilians who plunge in an unprecedented indebtedness and scrape by in low-paying jobs. President Lula's government insists on promoting progressive values and ways of life which do not resonate with the majority of the population, which remains very conservative, like the promotion of supposed abortion rights and the trans agenda, which are both extremely unpopular. At the same time, about 50% of Brazilians now live in areas ruled and terrorized by organized crime groups as the Comando Vermelho and the PCC. Some of those groups President Trump is about to officially label as terrorist organizations and threats to American internal security. Lula has frankly no answer at all to all these concerns, which affect the majority of the population. Lula's party, the PT, has consistently for decades been against any harsher measures against crime, and most of Lula's intellectual supporters consider harsher measures to crime simply as a form of structural racism and hate for the poor. For all these reasons, any candidate who opposes Lula is automatically popular on many parts of Brazil. And that's the best explanation for all the popularity that Flávio Bolsonaro now enjoys. If nothing changed before the second round of the election in November, Lula has basically two options, and neither is pleasant. He may take a great risk of ending his outstanding career in a humiliating defeat, or he may simply give up at some moment in the next months, unless one of his allies lose the election on his electoral ticket, as President Biden did for Kamala Harris. It is in this desperate situation for a politician full of himself as Lula that a sinister and cunning plan seems to have been conceived by him or his entourage. The plan is to relentlessly provoke President Trump into overreacting, so that Lula may then take advantage of President Trump's response to position himself back as the champion of Brazilian sovereignty against an imperialist superpower and its internal vile allies inside Brazil, the Bolsonaro family, including of course Flávio Bolsonaro. If Trump reacts with harsh tariffs, it's easy for Lula to position himself as Brazil's sovereignty champion, as someone against a foreign intervention that damages Brazil's economy.
Brazil is going to be the battleground where the future of the hemisphere will be fought, because Brazil is America's solution to break independence on China for critical minerals, especially rare earth elements. Right now, America still depends on China for about 70% of rare earth imports, and China controls 70% of global mining and over 90% of refining and processing. Why does it matter? These rare earths are essential for computer processors and EA revolution that's transforming our world and the American defense equipment.
Some are openly discussing this apparent strategy by Lula in the Brazilian press right now, but few have the courage to point out how dangerously evil it really is. If Trump reacts against Brazil with all the artillery of unbearable tariffs as he did last year, the whole country will suffer. Just to give a better last chance to a politician, according to this apparent strategy. President Lula's actions constitute a last betrayal in his long career on office. Now using his own country, the economy of his country, as a human shield against America, just to gain perhaps some popularity from the crisis that he is generating alone, by provoking Trump, by provoking an overreaction by him, just to try to target Flávio Bolsonaro at the end, as Flávio Bolsonaro is Trump's ally in Brazil, as the Bolsonaro family has such a close relation with Trump himself. I hope that President Trump doesn't let himself be used as a fool and as a tool by a trick master who simply cannot accept that his people, his own people, are finally getting tired of him. But it may be already too late for this warning.
This is Pix, the Brazilian payment system that completely undercut card companies by making everyday money transfers instant and basically free. Pix dominates Brazil. In 2024, it conducted more transactions than credit cards, debit cards, boletos, TED, prepaid cards, and checks combined, moving around 26 trillion reais across more than 63 billion transactions. So how did they build a payment system this big, fast, and cheap that became Brazil's default in just a couple of years? How is Pix, a Brazilian payment system, so politically sensitive that the US opened a trade investigation into Brazil's payment service? This might sound like a simple payment system story, but it's really a story about banks being forced to play along, private payment giants losing their grip, and what happens when an entire industry wakes up and realizes Brazil changed the game.
O presidente Lula reagiu hoje a novo relatório dos Estados Unidos que critica o PIX. Enquanto o governo Trump afirma que a ferramenta pode prejudicar empresas americanas, Lula disse que o Brasil não vai mudar o modelo.
Durante um evento em Salvador, Lula foi alertado pelo ministro da Secretaria de Comunicação. Sidônio Palmeira sussurrou ao ouvido do presidente que era preciso falar sobre o PIX, um tema popular e estratégico.
Não esqueça de falar do PIX.
Lula atendeu a sugestão.
O que é importante a gente dizer, para quem quiser nos ouvir, o PIX é do Brasil. E ninguém vai fazer a gente mudar o PIX pelo serviço que ele está prestando à sociedade brasileira.
Depois, o presidente reforçou a mensagem nas redes sociais e escreveu que o PIX é do Brasil. As manifestações reagem ao documento de mais de 500 páginas do governo americano, com referências a diversos países. Os Estados Unidos.
I don't believe Trump is actually going to do anything against PIX until the election is decided in November. If Lula wins, which seems very unlikely now, President Trump may retaliate against Brazil over PIX next year or later during Lula's fourth presidency. In any case, I don't think US grievances with the PIX model will really be a factor in this year's election. But one final point needs to be made to conclude this video. If President Trump reimposes harsh tariffs on Brazilian products for any reason, or takes a real and meaningful step against the PIX model, for example, by imposing taxes on Brazilian banks and companies that operate in the US to offset the losses American credit card companies are facing now in Brazil because of PIX. Then this year's election is effectively over if this happens, and if Trump really overreacts using tariffs and damaging Brazilian companies that operate in the US. If all this happens, this year's election is decided, and President Lula will have a very smooth path to a fourth term because he has the strongest stance against Trump intervention in Brazil, and this can effectively decide the election for him.